They called the grand ballroom of the Gibbs estate the Golden Cage. Not because of the literal 24-karat molding, but because once you entered, your soul belonged to the merger. Every third Friday, the world of high finance stopped. The stock tickers went silent, and the elite of Manhattan held their breath. Nobody dared to question the ironclad contracts of Lee K. Gibbs. Nobody except her. They thought she was just a domestic with a penchant for eavesdropping. They were wrong. She was the glitch in the algorithm that would dismantle a dynasty and rewrite the rules of the city from the wreckage of a scandal. This isn't a romance novel. This is how Doris W. Bratten unmasked a billionaire. The champagne at the Gibbs Gala didn't taste like celebration. It tasted like cold, hard debt. Inside the ballroom, the air was heavy with the scent of lilies and calculated betrayal. It was 7:55 p.m. on the night of the engagement of the century. The room was a sea of shimmering emerald silk and predatory smiles, but a sudden stillness was radiating from the head table like a looming storm. Doris W. Bratten adjusted her starched white apron, her fingers raw from polishing silver that cost more than her family's home. She was 26 with exhaustion that ran deeper than her marrow and a Selena name tag that wasn't even her own. She wasn't looking for a ring. She was looking for a way to keep the lights on. The diamond in Lee K. Gibbs's hand didn't just catch the light. It seemed to swallow it, casting a cold, blinding radiance that froze the entire grand ballroom. He was down on one knee, his tailored navy suit sharp against the marble floor, but his focus wasn't on the woman in the emerald gown. It was anchored on Doris, who stood paralyzed, her fingers still curled around the edge of an empty silver tray. Behind him, Madelaine Rowland was a portrait of crumbling porcelain. The socialite's breath hitched, a jagged sound that cut through the silence as her first tear escaped, carving a path through smudged mascara. The high society crowd, the social jury, in their tuxedos and silk, gasped in a single synchronized wave of disbelief. They had come to witness a merger of empires. They were watching a suicide of status. Doris felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, but it was Lee's gaze that anchored her. There was no corporate calculation in his expression, only a raw, terrifying vulnerability. The Selena name tag on her chest felt like a brand of a life she was about to outrun. Her hands flew to her face, her breath hitching in her throat as the sheer impossibility of the moment crashed down. In the center of the golden cage, the billionaire wasn't looking for a partner to balance his books. He was looking for the only woman who had ever seen him clearly through the dust. The Gibbs estate was less of a home and more of a museum dedicated to the concept of loneliness. Doris moved through the corridors with the practiced silence of a ghost, her soft-soled shoes barely whispering against the white marble. To the world outside the iron gates, this was the pinnacle of achievement, but from the inside, it was a series of glass walls designed to keep the warmth of the world at bay. She reached the east wing, where the air grew noticeably colder, scented with the expensive, antiseptic fragrance of lilies that Madelaine Rowland insisted on having replaced every 48 hours. Doris knelt to polish the baseboards of the corridor leading to Lee's private study, her reflection staring back at her from the high-gloss wood. A girl in a navy uniform whose only value was her ability to remain unseen. Through the cracked door of the study, she saw him. Lee K. Gibbs was framed by a floor-to-ceiling window, the skyline of Manhattan sprawling behind him like a conquered kingdom. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a man encased in ice. He was staring at a velvet-lined box on his desk, the engagement ring inside glowing with a clinical, predatory light. There was no joy in the room, only the suffocating pressure of a contract waiting to be signed. Earlier that morning, Doris had cleared away a breakfast tray that hadn't been touched, save for a single cup of black coffee that had gone cold. She had watched from the shadows as Madelaine stood in this same room, discussing the brand synergy of their union, while Lee stared at the wall behind her head. It wasn't a romance. It was a hostile takeover of a human life. As Doris reached for her spray bottle, the squeak of the plastic triggered a sudden movement. Lee turned, his sharp features illuminated by the harsh afternoon sun. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, not as boss and servant, but as two people trapped in different rooms of the same prison. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes matching the ones Doris hid with cheap concealer every morning. He didn't bark an order or dismiss her. He simply looked at the rag in her hand, then back at the skyline, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. In that silence, the glass walls seemed to vibrate. Doris realized then that the billionaire in the tailored suit was just as desperate for a way out as the maid who scrubbed his floors. She turned back to the baseboards, her heart hammering against her ribs, knowing that the engagement of the century was nothing more than a beautifully decorated tomb. The guest wing of the Gibbs estate was a sanctuary of high-end vanity, a labyrinth of silk wallpaper and gilded mirrors that reflected a world Doris could never touch. As she pushed her cleaning cart down the plush, cream-colored runner, the air changed, shifting from the masculine scent of Lee's sandalwood to the cloying, aggressive perfume of Madelaine Rowland. It was the smell of a woman who didn't just inhabit a room, but colonized it. Doris entered the master guest suite, her hands moving with the mechanical efficiency of a life spent in service. She began with the vanity, clearing away the clutter of diamond-encrusted compacts and discarded invitations. That was when she saw it. A heavy, cream-colored envelope tucked haphazardly beneath a stack of bridal magazines. It wasn't the stationery that caught her eye, but the crest, the seal of the Sterling Group, Lee's primary corporate rival. Her heart did a slow, heavy roll in her chest. A maid's greatest asset was her invisibility, but her second was her ability to read the room. She knew that crest. She had seen it on the Do Not Admit list at the front gate. With a quick glance toward the heavy oak door, Doris pulled a single, folded sheet from the envelope. It wasn't a love letter, though the betrayal it contained was far more intimate. It was a structured plan for a leveraged buyout, dated for the morning after the wedding. Madelaine's handwriting, elegant, looping, and cold, was scrawled in the margins, detailing Lee's private passwords and the security protocols of his offshore accounts. It was a roadmap for a massacre. The Rowlands weren't marrying into the Gibbs family. They were skinning it alive. A sharp, clicking sound echoed from the hallway, the unmistakable rhythm of Madelaine's designer heels on the marble. Doris didn't panic. Panic was for people who had something to lose. She tucked the paper back into the envelope, slid it exactly where she had found it, and began buffing the surface of the mahogany desk with a microfiber cloth just as the door swung open. Madelaine stood in the doorway, a vision of emerald green and practiced perfection. She didn't look at Doris. She looked through her, as if she were just another piece of furniture to be dusted. "You missed a spot on the mirror, Selena," Madelaine remarked, her voice like shards of ice in a silk bag. "I'll attend to it immediately, Miss Rowland," Doris replied, her voice low and even. She kept her head down, her pulse thundering against the collar of her uniform. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted. Madelaine thought she held the world in her manicured hands, but Doris now held the one thing the Rowlands couldn't buy, the truth. As she moved to the mirror, Doris caught her own reflection. Tired, invisible, but dangerous. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a witness. The clock on the study wall chimed midnight, a low, melodic sound that seemed to vibrate through the heavy silence of the estate. Lee K. Gibbs sat behind his mahogany desk, the amber liquid in his crystal glass barely catching the dim light of a single desk lamp. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man watching his own execution. Doris entered without knocking, her presence as subtle as a shifting shadow. She didn't carry her usual cleaning tray. Instead, she held a small plate with 2 squares of dark chocolate and a fresh glass of ice. She moved toward the desk, aware of the tension radiating from him. A storm held back by nothing but sheer will. "I didn't call for service," Lee said, his voice a jagged rasp that would have sent any other staff member scurrying for the servants' stairs. "You haven't slept in 3 days, Mr. Gibbs?" Doris replied calmly, setting the ice beside his bottle of whiskey. "And the Rowland family's choice of champagne doesn't pair well with a silent room." Lee's head snapped up, his dark eyes narrowing. He stood abruptly, the chair skidding back with a harsh screech against the floorboards. He was a man used to people flinching at his movement, used to the way his board members lowered their eyes and his fiancée's voice turned high and frantic when he lost his temper. But Doris simply stood there, her hands folded loosely at her waist, watching him with an expression of quiet, steady gravity. "You're overstepping," he growled, leaning over the desk until he was inches from her face. "You're a maid. You are here to polish the silver, not to psychoanalyze the man who pays your wages. Do you have any idea how easily I could have you replaced?" He waited for the flicker of fear, the stammer, the submissive tilt of the head. It never came. Doris didn't blink. She didn't move back. She looked into the wreckage of his gaze and saw the panic he was trying to hide behind his rage. "You could," she said, her voice a soft, unwavering anchor. "But then you'd be back to drinking alone in the dark with people who only love your shadow. And the ice is melting." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating quiet of the golden cage, but a rare moment of equilibrium. Lee's shoulders dropped, the fire in his eyes replaced by a weary sort of wonder. He realized then that she was the only person in his life who didn't shake when he roared. She wasn't impressed by the billionaire, and she wasn't terrified of the man. He reached for the whiskey bottle, but instead of pouring a glass for himself, he paused. "Sit down, Doris," he murmured, the name feeling heavy and new on his tongue. "Tell me what else you've noticed while you were busy being invisible." The morning light in the guest wing was sharp and unforgiving, turning the dust motes into tiny, drifting sparks. Doris was in the process of replacing the lilies, the same cloying white blooms that now felt like funeral arrangements, when the click of the door lock echoed like a gunshot. Madelaine Rowland didn't enter the room so much as she glided into it, her presence a cold front that sucked the air from the space. In her hand, she clutched a sleek, black leather binder, its edges silver-tipped and lethal. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "You're a quiet thing, aren't you, Selena? Or Doris? Or whatever name is currently on your tax forms," Madelaine said, her voice dropping the sugary facade of the socialite. She tossed the binder onto the unmade bed. It landed with a heavy, ominous thud. "I noticed you spent quite a bit of time in the study last night, and I noticed the Sterling Group envelope has been moved by exactly 3 inches. Doris didn't stop her work. She carefully trimmed a stem, her hands steady despite the sudden, icy sweat slicking her spine. "I was cleaning, Miss Rowland. Surfaces are often moved during the process. Don't play the simpleton with me. It's beneath us both," Madelaine hissed, stepping into Doris's personal space. She flipped the binder open. Inside were photographs, grainy, long-lens shots of Doris at a local clinic, an old hospital bill with a mounting, unpaid balance, and a photocopy of a private agreement regarding her brother's care. "This is your life, Doris. A series of debts and desperate choices. If Lee finds out his invisible witness is actually a thief who's been skimming from the grocery accounts to pay for her brother's heart medication, how long do you think you'll last?" The air in the room turned stagnant. The accusation was a lie. Doris had never stolen a cent. But in the world of the Rowlands, a well-crafted lie was more powerful than a hidden truth. "I haven't stolen anything," Doris said, her voice a low, dangerous calm. "It doesn't matter." Madelaine smiled, a slow, cruel curve of her lips. "By tonight, the police will find the missing jewelry in your locker. You have 2 choices. You walk out that gate right now and never look back, or you stay silent during the toast and let this merger happen. If you try to play the hero, I won't just fire you. I will dismantle the life you've worked so hard to protect." Madelaine leaned in closer, the scent of her perfume like a chokehold. "Decide, little mouse. Is Lee's empire worth your brother's life? Because tonight, one of them has to burn. As the door clicked shut behind the socialite, Doris looked down at the lilies. She was no longer just a witness. She was a target. The choice was a jagged blade, and no matter how she held it, she was going to bleed. The following evening, the air in the study was thick with the scent of rain and expensive tobacco. Lee sat at his desk, but the usual armor of his composure had cracks in it. He looked up as Doris entered, and this time, he didn't wait for her to approach. He tossed a heavy, leather-bound folder onto the desk. The official merger contract that would bind his life to Madelaine's at tomorrow's gala. "It's a death warrant," he said, his voice stripped of its usual billionaire bravado. "The board is leaning on me. The Rowlands have bought up 40% of the debt my father left behind. If I don't sign this, they trigger a liquidation. I lose the company, the estate, everything. I'm being traded like a piece of livestock in a tuxedo." Doris didn't look at the contract. She moved toward the window, pulling the heavy velvet drapes shut against the prying eyes of the city. "You aren't a piece of livestock, Mr. Gibbs, but you are being hunted by people who have spent a lifetime perfecting the trap." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, crumpled slip of paper, a carbon copy of a wire transfer she had found in the trash of the guest wing. She placed it on top of the merger agreement, right over the line where his signature was supposed to go. "Look at the dates," she whispered. "The Rowlands didn't just buy your debt to save you. They bought it using capital from the Sterling Group. They aren't merging with you. They're acting as a front for your biggest rival. The moment you say, 'I do,' the Sterling Group will exercise a hidden clause to seize your intellectual property. Madelaine isn't looking for a husband. She's looking for the keys to the vault." Lee leaned forward, his eyes scanning the numbers with the speed of a man who lived and died by the ledger. The blood drained from his face as the details Doris had collected. The overheard phone calls, the shredded documents, the secret crests, all locked into a single, devastating picture. "They've been inside my house for months," Lee breathed, his hands clenching into fists on the mahogany surface. "And I was too blinded by the merger to see the knife at my throat." "You were looking at the sun," Doris said softly, stepping closer until she was within the circle of the lamplight. "I've spent my life in the shadows. You see the empire, Mr. Gibbs. I see the cracks in the foundation." Lee looked up at her, and for the first time, the invisible Maid was the only person in his world who had any color. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the rough fabric of her sleeve. "They think they've won," he murmured, a dark, dangerous spark returning to his eyes. "They think they've bought the house and everyone in it." "Then let them keep thinking that," Doris replied, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "Until the toast." The delivery arrived in a plain, unmarked box, tucked away in the back of the service elevator where only Doris would find it. When she peeled back the layers of tissue paper, she didn't find the stiff, polyester blend of a standard catering uniform. Instead, her fingers sank into a fabric that felt like liquid midnight, a deep, shimmering navy silk that seemed to hold its own light. There was a note pinned to the shoulder, written in Lee's sharp, decisive hand. "For the staff viewing at the mezzanine. I need my most observant eyes in the room." Doris stood in the small, cramped servants' quarters, the silk gown draped over her arms like a stolen secret. It was a masterpiece of design, elegant enough to grace a gala but subtle enough to remain a shadow. It was a dress for a ghost, a woman who was meant to be seen but not noticed. Yet, as she held it against herself in the cracked mirror, she realized the measurements were perfect. He hadn't just ordered a size. He had remembered the curve of her shoulders from their midnight whiskey, the height of her frame from the times she had stood her ground in his study. The knock at the door was soft, almost hesitant. When she opened it, Lee was standing in the narrow hallway, looking entirely out of place against the peeling wallpaper and the smell of industrial floor wax. He was already in his tuxedo, the white shirt crisp against his tan skin, but his tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck. He stopped, his gaze raking over the gown in her arms and then rising to her face. For a long moment, the billionaire who controlled half of the city's skyline forgot to breathe. "It fits," he murmured, his voice dropping into that low, resonant frequency that always made Doris's pulse skip. "It's too much for a maid, Mr. Gibbs," Doris said, her voice trembling slightly. "The Rowlands will notice. Madelaine will know." Lee stepped into the room, closing the distance between them until the scent of his sandalwood cologne overwhelmed the scent of the lilies. He reached out, his thumb grazing the silk near her collarbone, but his eyes never left hers. "Madelaine looks at people and sees assets or obstacles," he said, his fingers lingering just a second too long against the fabric. "I look at you, Doris, and I see the only truth left in this house. You aren't wearing this to hide. You're wearing it because tonight, the ghosts are taking over the machine." He reached up, slowly tightening his own tie, but his eyes remained locked on hers, a silent promise shimmering between them. He wasn't just giving her a disguise. He was giving her armor. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door, his silhouette tall and formidable. "Dress quickly. The world is waiting to be disappointed, and I'd hate to keep them waiting without my partner." Breaking point. The grand ballroom was a choreographed masterpiece of deceit, a swirl of tuxedos and silk that glittered under the weight of 1,000 crystal prisms. It was 8 p.m., the air vibrating with the low hum of power and the clink of gold-rimmed crystal. From the mezzanine, Doris watched the spectacle unfold, the navy silk of her gown blending into the shadows. Below, Lee moved through the crowd like a man walking toward a firing squad, his face a mask of ironclad composure. The Rowlands were already celebrating. Madelaine was a vision in her shimmering emerald gown, her laughter light and melodic, though her eyes remained as sharp and predatory as a hawk's. Beside her, her father, Arthur Rowland, held a glass of vintage champagne, his gaze frequently drifting to the heavy mahogany podium at the front of the room. They weren't just waiting for a wedding announcement. They were waiting for the clock to strike midnight so the Sterling Group could trigger the liquidation of Lee's life's work. Doris could see the trap closing. She saw the subtle nods between Arthur and the two men standing near the perimeter, Sterling's primary legal counsel, disguised as guests. She saw the way Madelaine's hand rested on Lee's arm, not with affection, but with the possessive grip of a conqueror. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of impending ruin. As the orchestra transitioned into a slow, sweeping waltz, Arthur Rowland stepped toward the microphone. The room fell into a practiced, expectant silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arthur's voice boomed, rich with unearned triumph. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate the union of two people. We celebrate the merger of two legacies. A union that will redefine the skyline of this city." He raised his glass, his eyes locking onto Lee's with a look of smug satisfaction. The trap was set, the documents were ready, and the social jury was poised to witness the final signature. Doris felt the weight of the flash drive in her clutch, the evidence of the Rowlands' secret dealings, and her gaze met Lee's across the vast, opalescent space. The silence stretched, brittle as ice, as the world waited for the billionaire to bow. But in the dim light of the mezzanine, the invisible witness saw the change in Lee's eyes. He wasn't looking at the podium. He was looking at the exit. The final toast was about to become the first strike. The silence in the ballroom was a physical weight, thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of an impending execution. Lee stepped toward the podium, his silhouette cutting a sharp, dark line against the gold-leafed backdrop. Arthur Rowland smiled, a predator watching the trap snap shut, and Madelaine straightened her emerald gown, already wearing the crown of a queen who had conquered her king. Lee reached for the microphone. His hand didn't shake. "Tonight," he began, His voice amplified until it rattled the crystal chandeliers. The Rowland family expected a signature. They expected a merger that would bury the Gibbs legacy under the weight of their own greed. A confused murmur rippled through the socialites, but Lee didn't pause. He looked directly at Arthur, whose smile was beginning to fray at the edges. I've spent months watching you move through my house like a ghost, Arthur. I watched you buy up my debt with Sterling Group Capital. I watched your daughter map out my security protocols while she pretended to pick out wedding china. Madelaine's face drained of color, her eyes darting to the mezzanine. Lee's voice turned into a blade. You didn't come for a partnership. You came for a carcass. But there's a flaw in being a predator. You become so focused on the kill that you forget to watch the shadows. With a sharp gesture, the massive LED screens behind the stage flickered to life. They didn't show engagement photos. They showed the wire transfers Doris had found, the secret contracts with the Sterling Group, and the audio recordings of Madelaine's blackmail threats. The social jury gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like a breaking wave. The merger is dead, Lee declared, the words echoing like a gavel. He turned to Madelaine, who was trembling, her mascara beginning to run. And you, Madelaine, are no longer a guest in this house. He didn't wait for her to speak. He didn't wait for the security team, now loyal only to him, to escort the Rowlands out. He simply unpinned the white rose from his lapel and let it fall to the marble floor. In a room full of the most powerful people in Manhattan, Lee K. Gibbs turned his back on the Rowland dynasty. He walked away from the emerald gown and the poisoned champagne. His eyes locked on the mezzanine where a single figure in navy silk waited in the dark. The billionaire was finally free, and the house was finally his own. The silence following the collapse of the Rowland dynasty was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the grand ballroom. Lee walked through the center of the crowd, the sea of tuxedos and gowns parting for him like water before a storm. He didn't look back at the ruin he had left on the stage. His focus was entirely on the mezzanine stairs, where Doris stood in the shadows. As he reached the foot of the staircase, he stopped. In a movement that sent a fresh shockwave through the social jury, the man who bowed to no one dropped to one knee. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet-lined box. But this time, the diamond inside didn't look like a clinical corporate asset. In the low light, it glowed with a fierce, protective warmth. Doris, he said, his voice carrying without the aid of a microphone, cutting through the stunned whispers of the elite. For years, I've been surrounded by people who polished my shoes while sharpening their knives. I was a man living in a house of mirrors, seeing nothing but my own isolation. Doris stepped out of the dark, the navy silk of her gown shimmering like the deep Atlantic. Her hands flew to her face, her breath hitching as she looked down at the billionaire who had finally traded his armor for vulnerability. The Selena name tag she had worn for years felt like a relic of a past life, a skin she was finally ready to shed. You were the only one who didn't shake, Lee continued, his gaze locked on hers with a raw intensity that ignored the hundreds of cameras and gaping mouths surrounding them. You were the only one who saw the cracks and didn't try to tear them wider. I don't want a partner for a merger. I want the woman who saved the man behind the desk. Doris W. Bratten, will you sit at the head of this table with me? The disbelief in the room was palpable, a physical tension that broke only when Doris lowered her hands. She looked at the ring, then at the man who had spent his life looking for a truth he finally found in the help. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the glitch that had rewritten the code of his world. Yes, she whispered, her voice steady and clear. As Lee slid the diamond onto her finger, Doris let go of the railing. She didn't just accept a proposal. She accepted a throne. She stepped off the stairs and took his hand, walking back through the crowd as an equal. The golden cage was no longer a prison. It was a kingdom, and the maid had just become the bride who would lead it.